So, with the Age of Apocalypse continuing in the next few days, and John Bernthal being confirmed to play the role of the Punisher in season 2 of Daredevil, I figured why not make a video about Punisher kills the Marvel Universe. Now, keep in mind, as with stories like this, and Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe, this takes place in an alternate reality. So the story picks up with both Frank Castle and Matt Murdock as kids, and really seems to set the stage for the mind of Frank Castle in that he discovers Matt Murdock is being bullied by various other kids. In response to this, Frank Castle beats up the kids and then forces them off of Matt Murdock. And so what happens is that Matt Murdock and Frank Castle seem to become friends, or at the very least, Matt Murdock becomes someone that Frank Castle looks out for. Now, following this, Marvel just jumps forward here, and they don't really give us any insight into the later years of either character, that is to say, what happened as they grew up. What we find is that we're in the normal Earth 616 reality, that is to say, the main Marvel universe, that Frank Castle's family had basically died due to being caught in the crossfire of a gangland shooting. But in this universe, we join what appears to be some kind of a massive battle in Central Park involving the X-Men and the Avengers who are fighting the Skrulls. Now, the result is that Frank Castle actually overhears the conflict since he's part of the NYPD SWAT team, and he recalls that his wife and children had been spending the day in Central Park. And so once he arrives, he realizes that multiple innocents had been killed in the conflict, which included his wife and kids. Now, while Cyclops of the X-Men initially tries to explain that the attack happened at the last minute and that there wasn't really time to evacuate anybody, Frank Castle doesn't want to hear it, and instead, he simply takes out his gun and he shoots Cyclops in the face, along with Jubilee and Hawkeye. Now, the result here is that Frank Castle is immediately attacked by Wolverine, but Wolverine's actually subdued by Colossus, and Frank Castle is placed under arrest. Now, at this point, we jump to Matt Murdock, who's representing Frank Castle during his trial, but because of Frank Castle's history with the Marine Corps, and because he had murdered some of the biggest heroes at the time, Frank Castle is basically sentenced to life in prison. However, while Frank Castle is presumably being transported to Rikers Island where he'll serve out his sentence, he actually finds when he arrives at his destination that it's actually the home of a man named Kesselring. Now, what happens here is that Kesselring, along with various other individuals, represent the victims of people who had been killed in conflicts involving superheroes and supervillains. And so what Kesselring says is that this society appears to be turning a blind eye. That is to say, everybody else in the world, governments and things like that, but they seem to be turning a blind eye to the death of innocents so long as these superheroes win. And so what happens is that Kesselring and his group agree to finance the operations of the Punisher if he's willing to go about the mission of killing anyone and everyone who refers to themselves as superpowered, whether they be heroes or villains. And so with the death of his family weighing on his mind, Frank Castle agrees. And so at this point, we jump to Spider-Man and Venom, who are actually fighting in the sewers of New York. Now, Marvel doesn't really give us a long drawn-out scene here. Instead, while both Spider-Man and Venom are fighting, the Punisher sneaks in and basically bombards the two of them with electric barbs that incapacitate the two and actually cause Venom to revert back to his normal form of Eddie Brock. Now, once Spider-Man realizes that the Punisher's killed Venom, Spider-Man begins pleading with Frank Castle, asking why it is that he has to die. And in what I consider to be one of the coolest moments of the story, he doesn't really answer Spider-Man directly, he simply just shoots him. And then we switch to the Punisher simply saying that someone had to be the first person to die. Now from here, we jump to the Incredible Hulk, and I think this is something that a lot of people were curious about. How is the Incredible Hulk going to die at the hands of the Punisher? Well, what happens here is the Incredible Hulk appears to be either rampaging or fighting a villain. We don't know, and in fact, Marvel, if he is fighting a villain, they don't show us. But what happens here is that Frank Castle views or watches the Hulk and shoots him with a tracking device. And so what happens is that Frank Castle uses this kind of, homing signal of some kind, or some kind of a homing device, and follows the Incredible Hulk. And once the Incredible Hulk turns back into Bruce Banner, Frank Castle shoots him. Now, here's the big question. Under normal circumstances, we would assume that that Bruce Banner would probably transform into the Incredible Hulk and spit the bullet out. Marvel doesn't do this. Instead, with the Incredible Hulk, and like we'll see with Wolverine, Marvel simply just says they're dead. and that's it. They don't really give us any kind of an explanation in terms of what would normally happen under this circumstance. Regardless, though, what we do here is we follow Frank Castle as he meets up with a hacker sidekick named Microchip. And Microchip's actually assisting Frank Castle with the information, or I guess getting him the information he needs in order to take down the various superheroes. What we find here is that Frank Castle's next intended target is the Kingpin. And with the help of Microchip, Frank Castle's actually able to subdue the entire security system and the security forces of the Kingpin and eventually confront the Kingpin himself. Now, where Kingpin initially states that he believed Frank Castle was only targeting heroes and that the Kingpin had actually applauded his actions and even created this huge store of weapons that Frank Castle could use, what happens is that the Kingpin realizes that Frank Castle's targeting both heroes and villains. And so what ends up taking place here is a scuffle between the two of them, and Frank Castle actually shoots the Kingpin in the eye. And so what happens is that the Kingpin seems to jump onto Frank Castle, seems to physically grab him, but Frank Castle uses his gun and he shoots Kingpin in the bottom of the head, which basically comes out the top, and it kills the Kingpin. And so the Kingpin actually lands on Frank Castle with Frank Castle stuck underneath him. And so what happens is that the authorities arrive and they subdue Frank Castle and they take him to jail. And of course, he's sentenced to life in prison again for a second time. Now, the issue here is that Matt Murdock is basically trying to operate or trying to get Frank Castle to understand the ramifications of his actions. He's trying to tell him that if he keeps going down this path, that things are going to end badly. Either they're going to end badly for Frank Castle, or they're going to end badly for everybody that Frank Castle knows, which in truth isn't really a way to appeal to Frank Castle, since as far as he's concerned, everybody he cares about is dead. But at this point, what we do is we find that when Frank Castle is being transferred to prison a second time, that again, his transfer is intercepted by Kesselring, and they bring him before the community, or I guess the Society of Kesselring, and Frank Castle goes about the process of continuing his mission again. Now, at this point, we jump back again with Frank Castle and Microchip as they enter the domain of Latveria and Dr. Doom. What we're told here is that using some kind of a scrambler device that was among the stored weapons of Kingpin, the Microchip was actually able to disguise their helicopter as the Fantastic Four's Fantasta vehicle, I think is how it's pronounced. But what happens here is Dr. Doom believes that the Fantastic Four are actually coming to visit him. And so what ends up happening is he actually allows the group to enter, or allows Frank Castle and Microchip to enter his domain, not knowing it's the two of them. And so once Doom realizes that it's Frank Castle, the two of them engage in a conflict, and Doom immediately gains the upper hand. But what ends up happening here is Frank Castle actually takes a magnetic mine and attaches it to the head of Doom, which detonates. Now, what Frank Castle says is that this serves two purposes. The first purpose is to cause a feedback loop that will destroy the Doom bots, and the second is, by extension of the Doom bots being destroyed, it will help Frank Castle figure out which Dr. Doom is the real one. Now, once Frank Castle realizes that the Dr. Doom he's been fighting this whole time is actually the real Dr. Doom and not a robot, he takes a hammer down from off the wall and basically beats Dr. Doom to death with it. Now, from here, we follow Microchip and Frank Castle again to below the castle of Dr. Doom, and they actually end up locating a nuclear warhead. And the reason for this is because, as Frank Castle explains, he's basically going to start going against characters, especially with having defeated Dr. Doom, going against mutants and superpowered beings where guns just aren't going to be enough. And so what we do is we switch to the X-Men, X-Factor, and the X-Force teams on the moon as they're preparing to do battle with the forces of Magneto, Apocalypse, and Mr. Sinister. Now, initially, each group had believed that the other had summoned them there, but when they realized that they've been gathered under false pretenses, the nuclear bomb goes off. And so basically, Frank Castle's used a nuclear warhead to kill all of the X-Men and presumably a huge majority of the mutants. Now, again, with characters like Apocalypse, we would most likely assume they could survive a nuclear explosion. But again, Marvel doesn't address this. Marvel simply just says they're all dead, that they're non-existent in this universe anymore. Now, from here, we jump to Wolverine. And what Wolverine does here is he actually gives us a fair bit of information. What Wolverine tells us is that from the time the X-Men had died up until the current moment, that 3 years had passed, and that during this time, Frank Castle has killed 500 heroes heroes and villains from around the world, including the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, with only Captain America, Wolverine, and Daredevil left. Now, during his inebriated state, Wolverine's actually joined by Frank Castle, and after a brief scuffle, Frank Castle throws Wolverine's body into an electrical generator, which seems to overload Wolverine and actually disintegrates his entire body, leaving only his adamantium skeleton behind. Now again, we've seen instances where Wolverine's body has been disintegrated or else burned all the way down to his adamantium form, to his adamantium skeleton, and he's revived here, but that doesn't happen in this story. Instead, Wolverine is just dead. Marvel just kind of leaves it at that. Now, at this point, we jump to Captain America, and while he's in the middle of fighting Frank Castle, what seems to be happening here is that Captain America states that he's going to end Frank Castle's campaign. He's going to stop Frank Castle once and for all. But the kicker here is that Captain America had fought in World War II, and Frank Castle had fought in Vietnam. And what I mean by this is that, as Frank Castle explains here, Captain America fighting in World War II, with the way that he fought and the kind of skirmishes he was involved in, those did not require guerrilla warfare tactics. That is to say, hiding in bushes, setting mines, doing ambushes, things like that. But Frank Castle's time in Vietnam did. And so what happened was that Frank Castle had actually lured Captain America to this location. And when he did, he had stationed various weapons, handguns and so on, around this little, I guess, miniature patch of land. And so what happened here was that while Captain America was making his speech about how he's going to end Frank Castle and so on and so forth, Frank Castle grabs a sidearm and then shoots Captain America in the head. Now from here, we jump to the last fight, which actually takes place between Daredevil and Frank Castle. Now, while the two are fighting, Daredevil is constantly attempting to persuade Frank Castle to stop, but Frank Castle simply just doesn't. Now, where Daredevil is initially able to outfight and subdue Frank Castle, Daredevil also states that regardless of Frank Castle's anger towards those that killed his family, they were still people. And so Frank Castle counters this by saying that heroes and villains have adopted this attitude that because they have powers, that they can determine how the world is supposed to be, and that those who get in their way are simply just casualties. And so the problem here is that when Daredevil reaches to extend a hand to help Frank Castle up, presumably a kind of olive branch of friendship, that Frank Castle actually stabs him in the stomach. And so what ends up happening here is Frank Castle takes off the mask of Daredevil, and when he does, he realizes that Daredevil is his longtime friend Matt Murdock. And so what happens is that at this point, Matt Murdock says that there's always someone under the mask, and that people under the mask have friends, they have families and so on, but Frank Castle didn't see that because he was so swept up in his quest for vengeance, he didn't stop to think. And so what Daredevil says is that Frank Castle has killed all the superheroes, he's killed everybody, there's no heroes left. But Frank Castle stops and says no, he says there's still one hero left for him to kill, at which point he turns the gun on himself and pulls the trigger. And that brings it into the story. It's a single issue story. It is, in my opinion, one of the best Punisher stories written. It's pretty fantastic, but it's nowhere near as good as Punisher Max, but it's pretty fantastic. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.